And hi, I'm Jenna Axelrod, one of the assistant directors at the Perry Center. I'm honored to be hosting today. I'm here to help with anything that comes up that you can't say out loud on the Zoom. So feel free to send me a message in the chat if there's anything you need during the call. As you know, when you join, this session is being recorded. It's for archival purposes and to be available to all of you who signed up. It'll be about 3 days after the session that you'll get the link. Of course, if you could mute just during the presentation, that would be helpful to everyone. And today we're going to hear from our esteemed speaker for about an hour or so, and then we'll have an hour of question and answer. I'll be really happy to hear from all of you. So welcome everybody to the brain and our encounter with the world with the legendary Dr. Iain McGilchrist, psychiatrist, thinker, and author who has written on topics in literature, philosophy, medicine, psychiatry. Of course, he's the author of the widely acclaimed The Master and His Emissary. And we are very much looking forward to his new book release. It will be available November 9th, and it is called The Matter with Things, Our Brain, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. Very exciting. Please welcome Iain. I will hand it over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. That's great, Jenna. And thank you very much. I just wish I could be with you in Paris instead of in the southeast of England, where I'm staying with a friend. But there we are. What I want to do is talk to you about consciousness. Well, of course, we could talk for days about that. So I'm not going to aim to be in any sense exhaustive. In the new book, The Matter with Things, there is a chapter on matter and consciousness, chapter 25, which is a kind of short book length. And in it, I go into far more detail than I can possibly do tonight. I'm going to not really argue for things. I'm just going to give a point of view, really. And I want to leave time for questions, as Jenna said. So what I'm going to do is talk, first of all, very briefly about the possible relations between matter and consciousness. And really, there are many, many people that I could summon to support what I'm going to say, but I'm not going to do that. You can find them in the book. You probably know a lot of them. They may well have been mentioned. Great physicists and philosophers, but I'm going to do that very sparingly. I'm just going to give the conclusions, really, that I've come to about that in the first 20 minutes. After that, I'm going to talk about the particular matter of consciousness and life and their relationship, and whether or not brains play an important part in this, and if so, what. And then the third part is really some aspects of what we can learn about all this from the hemisphere hypothesis, which is what I first put forward in The Master and His Emissary, and have enormously elaborated philosophically in this new book forthcoming. So I'll begin on the first part, really, which is just to approach this problem known as the hard problem, of course, famously, about how we get consciousness out of matter. There's been no progress on this, as is very widely accepted. And I'm not surprised, because in a way, the whole matter is, the matter is misconceived. Maybe it's a question of conceiving it differently. The problem's only as hard as the way you set it up. And you can't get blood out of the stone, and maybe the attempt will leave you baffled. Effectively, in brief, I think there are three possible relationships between, let's say, the brain and consciousness to begin with, and I'll take it further as we go on. They are effectively that consciousness is an emission of the brain, or it is a transmission by the brain, or the position I will argue for, that the role of the brain is permission, which is closer to transmission in that I suggest that consciousness is clearly not originated in the brain, but not just that it is somehow passively transmitted either, but that it shapes, forms, and brings into being the consciousness that we experience through a process of permission. The important point there is that some things are allowed, as it were, to be transmitted and others are not. It's a process of sculpture, another image I will come back to. And we know, don't we, that from listening to many eminent biologists speaking about this, that kind of a lot of them seem still to believe that consciousness is some kind of secretion of the brain. The reason I think that this emission hypothesis, rather than transmission or permission, has gained a certain degree of traction amongst biologists is that they think that we understand matter. And so at least we've got somewhere with that. And so if we can recouch consciousness in terms of matter, then we can understand it better. But of course, we don't understand matter. In fact, matter has been said to be more mysterious, and I would subscribe to that entirely. And I'll say a little bit about that as well as we go along. More mysterious than consciousness, and certainly not independent of it. Matter and consciousness have been many times commented on as essentially incommensurate, even apparently logically incompossible, and yet we know that they seem to exist alongside one another and in some sort of relationship. And the point's been very vividly made by a lot of people, including the great physiologist Charles Sherrington, by William James, by many others, that it just is a baffling thing. So the response to this has been to try various ways of resolving the conundrum, cutting the Gordian knot. And one way you can do this is simply to deny the existence of consciousness. Another is to deny the existence of matter. You could say they both exist, but are just totally distinct. You could say they exist, but are effectively the same. Or you could say, again, a position, spoiler alert, that I take to be the most promising, that they are distinct phenomena reflecting different aspects of a nonetheless indivisible reality. One of the problems with our attempts to get a hold on consciousness is that we think in terms of things and thingness, a theme of my book, The Matter with Things, as you can probably tell from the title, which contains a couple of puns. And both in The Master and His Emissary and in The Matter with Things, I try to get away from our obsession with things and whatness towards processes and howness. And I've already argued in The Master and His Emissary, and I have much more evidence that this is the case now, that effectively the legacy of the left hemisphere mode of conceiving the world is that we think of it as made up of things that then have to be somehow connected by a schema that we develop. Whereas the right hemisphere is very skilled at seeing not just, as it were, what is there, but the howness of it, the quality of it, the nature of it, the disposition that is involved in its coming into being for us. So that relates us to the hemispheres, which is what I'll try to come back to at the end of this talk. Very quickly, what do we mean by consciousness? This is a quagmire, of course, and I'm not going to step into that quagmire now. For those who are interested in differentiating different meanings of the term, I recommend Adam Zeman's Consciousness, a User's Guide. I think it's a very sensible book. And it helps clear the decks of certain confusions. I mean, consciousness may be what you lose when you get knocked out, or it may be what you think goes missing when you die, or whatever it might be. These are all quite different senses. What I think that overall I am talking about is the experiential, something that has inwardness. And this covers all the activities that go on for each of us, as we say, unconsciously and pre-consciously, as well as consciously. I don't think that we should think of conscious thought and unconscious thought, as there is a tendency sometimes to do, as inhabiting different tanks, almost like an aquarium in which there are sort of different areas the fish swim in, and there's a little hatch they can pop up from the unconscious into the realm of the conscious. Instead, I would like to give the image of a stage in which the spotlight moves on the stage, and at one time it's on the left wing of the stage, so that we are completely aware of and focused on. But it's not as though the rest of the stage has gone missing or anything like that. It's in fact every bit as present. It's just that right now we're not focused on it. That, of course, for those of you who know the hemisphere hypothesis, is important, because what is present in the center of the focus of consciousness is the only bit really that the left hemisphere seems to take account of, whereas the right hemisphere takes account of all that is not currently being focused on, all that is implicit rather than explicit, all that is known intuitively from experience, and can cope with an enormous array of meanings and information. It's a very much more efficient information processor, a phrase I never thought I'd speak about the brain, but let me take on the terms of those who speak about the brain as such a thing. It is a very much more efficient, has a much more efficient way of handling enormous amounts of knowledge, experience, and understanding. It has been, to my, and no doubt your amusement, in a serious academic paper, been stated that the extent of the unconscious is 99.44% of all that goes on in that realm, that is the field of us, of the stuff that is experiential. And you don't have to buy the precision to get the idea that actually we're only consciously aware of a very small part of all that we know. What's important to me is that this is in no way inferior. It's not consciousness that the moths have got into. It's actually much the most important part, not just the most extensive part of experience. And as Julian Jaynes pointed out, it's in our unconscious minds that we do many things that we would describe as definingly intelligent about our take on the world. We discriminate, we reason, we make judgments, we find things beautiful, we solve problems, we take decisions, we weigh possible outcomes, we imagine possibilities, we exercise acquired skills, we fall in love, we struggle to balance competing desires and moral values all the time without being reflexively aware of it. And these are not just calculations, but rely on my whole embodied being, my experience, my history, my memory, my feelings, my thoughts, my personality, even, dare I say it, my soul, my psyche in the broadest sense. And indeed, there's something wrong when I'm conscious of what's going on, in the sense that we bring consciousness into play when there is a problem, when there is a discrepancy, when there is something that draws our focused attention to resolving a tension. And Whitehead, I like very, I mean, he is surely, if not the greatest, one of the greatest philosophers of the last 100 years, certainly in the English language. And Whitehead says, operations of thought, like cavalry charges in battle, they're strictly limited in number, they require fresh horses and must only be made in decisive moments. Something very similar was said by one of the other great philosophers of the last 100 years and more, William James. So much for arguments about what we mean by it for the moment. Can we take the first option, denying consciousness altogether? Well, it is a baffling fact that there are people who hold down chairs in respectable universities who have made a career out of promulgating the entirely improbable idea that consciousness is an illusion. An incoherent concept, of course, because even to conceive that it is an illusion, one needs consciousness, and where is it an illusion if not in consciousness itself? Of this, Galen Strawson says, I quote him because I just think he's so good on this topic. He's written a number of times about consciousness. And I'm quoting here from Real Materialism and Other Essays, 2008. By the way, the title is a bit misleading. He manages to use the term materialism in order to expand its meaning, to show that matter is something very, very interesting, complex, and not at all like what materialists, as we call them, think it to be. I myself say about materialists that they're not people who overvalue matter. They're people who completely undervalue matter. Anyway, Galen Strawson says, some philosophers are prepared to deny the existence of experience. At this, we should stop and wonder. I think we should feel very sober and a little afraid at the power of human credulity, the capacity of human minds to be gripped by theory, by faith. For this particular denial is the strangest thing that has ever happened in the whole history of human thought, not just the whole history of philosophy. It falls, unfortunately, to philosophy, not religion, to reveal the deepest woo-woo of the human mind. I find this grievous, but next to this denial, every known religious belief is only a little less sensible than the belief that grass is green. Galen is a mainstream Anglo-American analytic philosopher, and it's very good to see that nowadays quite a lot of them are beginning to wake up to the idea that consciousness is something perhaps absolutely foundational in the cosmos. It's a late feature of that movement, but it's one that Galen has done a great deal to promote and to write about very cogently. As he puts it, experience is itself the fundamental given natural fact. It's a very old point that there is nothing more certain than the existence of experience. And he takes to task Daniel Dennett's concept of the seeming to be experience. Because when it comes to experience, you can't open up, as he says, the is-seems gap. An illusion in what? Illusion requires consciousness. Could consciousness then be reduced to anything else at all? I could quote an army of the greatest Nobel Prize-winning physicists of the last 100 years, all of whom pretty directly stated that it's quite improbable or impossible that consciousness could ever be reduced to anything else. Certainly that would be my position. And I'm, as you know, certainly not alone in the world of physics and philosophy. I'm a little bit of an outsider in my home territory of the brain because it's part of the life sciences. We've now reached that point that David Bohm wittily pointed out, where those whose job it is to deal with inanimate matter have discovered that there is an animate universe, whereas those whose job it is to deal with animacy have come to the conclusion that it's all dead mechanism. A simple way of putting it is we know about the experiential directly from experience. It's the thing we know most about, although we understand perhaps very little of it. Well, we assume the non-experiential only indirectly from experience. Similarly, it cannot be denied that matter is something disclosed to me by my mind. I do not know that mind is something disclosed to me by matter. I mean, it might be, or it might not. And there's a sort of reverse anthropomorphism here, something that one finds throughout the field of consciousness when one starts looking at other living creatures other than humans. But there is an idea somehow that unless whatever it is you look at is doing the sorts of things humans do with consciousness, it can't possibly have any kind of consciousness. To say that experience exists, but it's really just something that the nature of which can be fully specified in wholly non-experiential terms, is to deny its existence. So that again falls into the category of things that are surely in the least promising category of attempts to solve this apparent hard problem. Can it emerge? I love this idea of emergence. It's like you wave a magic wand and you pass your hand over the situation and the rabbit just does emerge from the hat. It really doesn't explain anything. It simply black boxes it. On this, of course, William James was famously, and I'm sure you all know the passage, very funny when he tells a story from Midshipman Easy, a mid-19th century novel, in which there is a young woman with an illegitimate baby who excuses it by saying, "If you please, sir, it's a very little one." And he says there is no such thing as consciousness being nascent. It means not yet quite born, but once it's born, there it is. And I would call this the Midshipman Easy problem, which comes up when we try to suggest that somehow it emerges. I'll say a bit more about that in a few minutes. If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things, because it can't simply emerge out of matter. And if it did do, it would have to keep repeating this. Not only in evolution would it have to keep repeating it, but it would have to repeat it every time a creature is born, a creature to which we are prepared to admit consciousness. Of course, this should be all animals and more than animals, in my view, and I'll say a bit about that. But let's just take the case of the human being. Every single time a human being is born, somewhere along the line, if cells are inanimate, consciousness has done that amazing thing of just emerging. Nobody knows how, nobody knows when, nobody knows why either, something I might touch on. So that doesn't help us here. And the idea that consciousness can be said to emerge in the same way that the wateriness of water emerges from H2O molecules is again very deftly dealt with and very briefly dealt with by Galen Strawson, who points out that for something to be said to emerge from some other thing, there has to be some identifiable quality in that first thing that is said to be the foundation of the emergence, that it on its own, without any addition, can explain the emergence of whatever it is. Now, there is plenty we know about water molecules, which explains the emergence of their watery behavior. What matter does not have in any way is any hint as to how it could allow consciousness simply to emerge out of it, unless it already has consciousness in it. Well, could we try one of the other gambits? Can we deny matter altogether? Well, paradoxically, matter is itself an abstraction, a mental abstraction, which no one has ever seen. We've only seen elements of the world to which we attribute the quality within our consciousness of being material. In other words, it's an adjective, not a thing, that describes an experience. And it both substitutes an idea for an experience, which is a kind of event, and in doing so produces something static, no longer in process, no longer an experience, now a thing. This is a theme I deal with at length in The Matter with Things and won't go into now, but it does distinguish the ways in which the two hemispheres take hold of the world. One as static, immobile slices, which are representations of something that in reality is constantly changing, evolving, and flowing. And Niels Bohr says isolated material particles are abstractions, their properties being definable and observable only through their interaction with other systems. So materialism, you might say, derives the only thing we undeniably know, the concreteness of experience, from an unknown abstraction, matter, which is itself derived from experience. Here, I said I wouldn't adduce, Schrödinger, Planck, and all the rest of them, and I won't, but there's quite a nice little comment by Adam Frank, who's a physicist at New York University. Materialists appeal to physics to explain the mind, but in modern physics, the particles that make up a brain remain in many ways as mysterious as consciousness itself. Some consciousness researchers might think they're being hard-nosed and concrete when they appeal to the authority of physics. When pressed on this issue, though, we physicists are often left looking at our feet, smiling sheepishly and mumbling something about it's complicated. We know that matter remains mysterious, just as mind remains mysterious, and we don't know what the connections between those mysteries should be. Classifying consciousness as a material problem is tantamount to saying that consciousness too remains fundamentally unexplained. Putting the perceiving subject back into physics seems to undermine the whole materialist perspective. A theory of mind that depends on matter, that depends on mind, couldn't yield the solid ground so many materialists yearn for. However, it seems to me that we can and should no more deny matter than consciousness. I'm not arguing that this means we can dismiss either of them, as I say. And if asked, and we haven't time, so let me cut to the chase, I'd say that matter appears to be an element within consciousness that provides the necessary resistance for creation, and with it, inevitably, for individuality to arise. I see the cosmos as a process driven by something that constantly evolves and produces uniqueness and individuality, which is never atomistic or isolated from the whole, but in fact enriches and expresses part of what the nature of that whole is. All individual beings, including ourselves, bring forms into being and cause them to persist. That's where our material existence comes in. It causes them to persist. Schopenhauer says, matter is that which persists and endures. But each of us is not ultimately any one conformation in matter, but like the ship of Theseus, the conformation itself, the morphogenetic field, if you like, which requires matter in order to be brought into being, but once existent, persists while matter comes and goes within it. Well, are matter and consciousness then one and the same? There has been a reaction, as we all know, to Descartes' problem with two completely, as he thought, mutually unapproachable elements, the res cogitans, mind, and the res extensa, matter. But as we now know, there's nothing merely physical about the physical, and both physics and psychology show that they interact. We know that consciousness and the observation of an event in some respects seem to alter the nature of that physical event, to the extent that we can call it a physical event. And psychology also reveals that simply a thought or a belief can have very obvious manifestations in changing matter, not just changing obviously things in the brain, the way the brain grows, the connections that are formed between nerve cells, the balance of chemicals in the brain, all these can be altered simply by thinking or by belief. That's the whole basis of psychotherapy, but not just psychodynamic psychotherapy, CBT, the most straightforward mainstream therapies. But also, of course, things like hypnotism can cause manifest, measurable skin changes, and so on. So we know that consciousness can interact with matter. I won't labor the point because it seems to me very obvious. So we have to, I think, give up a conception of matter that excludes consciousness and a conception of consciousness that precludes matter, even though we may be able to conceive them distinctly only one at a time. Mass and energy are interconvertible. That's the meaning of E equals mc squared. The brain is a manifestation as mass, whereas the mind is a manifestation as energy. Now, it doesn't cut much ice with me that matter and consciousness don't look alike or behave similarly. What is water? Well, in one respect, it's a absolutely translucent flowing liquid. In another, it is a hard, opaque substance, so hard it can split your head open. And in another phase, it is invisible. It's dispersed into the air, which is water. Well, they're all water. They're all just different phases of water, and they behave differently and they look differently. I think that's a fair analogy for the idea of there being different phases. Don't mean, of course, temporal phases. I mean phases in the way in which physical chemists speak of phases of a liquid, for example. So I think they can be and are aspects of the same phenomenon, but or at least the same entity in different phenomenal guises. Schrödinger says it's the same elements that go to compose my mind and the world. The world is given to me only once, not one existing and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of recent experience in the physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist. Does that mean that we make reality up? Well, I argue this very strongly, that this is not the case. And I actually begin in the first few pages, first 10, 12 pages of the introduction, to lay out an idea, which I'm not going to do now because it would take up too much time, but which suggests that it is something like the performance of a piece of music. We don't make it up, but it only exists when we perform it. When we perform it, it's always slightly different, but it's always recognizably the same. It's not like we're all in our own delusional little boxes. And that fact doesn't preclude that some performances may be truer to the reality of that piece of music. And so we can be deluded about reality, or we can be more in touch with it. And our consciousness is not, in some entirely Berkeleyan idealistic way, originating it. Well, of course, he didn't think it originated. He thought it all originated in the mind of God. For me, that might equate to the realm of our mind that is the right hemisphere is better in touch with. But in any case, we do actually deal with reality and know it. We don't sort of, as it were, see a projection of it on a screen somewhere inside our heads, where an intracerebral homunculus watches it on an intracerebral sofa. This idea of watching a screen that is a representation is exactly what you would get when the left hemisphere, which doesn't understand the directness of experience, only deals with representations, which are, that is to say, things that are no longer actually present to us, but are now reconstructed in a diagrammatic map-like way. That's the image that it would come up with. I think that experience is the real deal, that when we experience something, when I see the light on the flowers outside this window, when I taste a strawberry, that is really the taste of a strawberry. That is really the light on the plants in the garden. It's just that my consciousness, no more than anyone else's, can see the whole of reality. Another image I often use here is that of the Japanese Zen garden, Ryoanji, in which there are 15 stones. But from any position in the garden, you can never see more than 14. So what you're seeing is really the stones of the garden, but you never can wholly get the picture. And so it's wise to have as many takes on reality and listen to as many wise understandings as possible and draw something from that, rather than fall into the typical black and white left hemisphere thing that either it's simply an image that is inside a box that has no contact with reality, or that in some entirely simplistic way, reality is just there and it's what one finds when one does an experiment. And of course, one finds something very real when one does that experiment, but it's only partial. And most importantly, the way in which we approach nature, the attention that we give to nature, governs what we find in nature and in reality. So we neither make reality up, nor is it simply out there. We midwife it into existence. That doesn't make it any less real that we have a part to play in it. The process of our acquiring knowledge alters in some essential way what it is we find when we look. In other words, the process is always genuinely creative, but once again, that doesn't make it less real. That makes it more part of the reality, which is always constantly creative. It is constantly coming into being, and I would argue is a state of the conscious universe finding out through this creative process its own potential, realizing its potential, and that potential feeding back always into, sorry, that realized potential feeding back into and enriching the overall field of potential of what then further comes into being. There has to be an electron to observe that we didn't put there, but the particular qualities and measurable characteristics of that electron come from our observation of it. It's a reciprocal process, actually. We change the world by our experience of it, and we don't just change it for ourselves. We also, in some sense, change what is there, even if only in, again, some partial way. But anyway, I don't want to go off too much into that yet. I want to try to stick to leaving time for questions. And on that question of reciprocity, which is a profoundly important idea, a theme of my new book, that everything is in fact reverberative and it exists only in the relation. I argue that in fact relations are prior to relata. They are prior to the things that are related. We only know what those things are when we see the web of relations out of which they emerge and in which they attract our attention and then become isolated as if they were things separate from the rest. I mean, of course, they're individuated, they're distinct, but we run far too swiftly from distinctness to division. So things emerge from descriptions of experience, and that includes the scale at which we observe it. I'll just say that now, I won't unpack it, but the scale at which we look at things changes the nature, their nature, their behavior, what comes to our attention, just as much as the quality of our attention does. Is consciousness then not just in us, but in everything that exists? This is effectively pan-experientialism, panpsychism, and I would say, broadly speaking, yes. There are different nuances to this, but effectively that is the position that I would hold. And as I say, it's heartening to see that it is gaining traction in a world which would have dismissed it probably 20 years ago. It's been always a way of looking at the world outside of the West in most cultures that we know, not because somehow they're simple-minded, but because in fact they have not had the same preconceptions and have therefore been able to see and experience things. As Goethe said, reality calls forth in us the faculties appropriate to appreciating it. And if you're taught to disattend to things long enough, you will no longer, the faculty for perceiving them will no longer be there. And so you will find that reality conforms to just what it was you have been taught to believe. In that way, it is simply a self-confirming process. But panpsychism is also an important element in the West, of course, in my favorite all-time philosopher Heraclitus, but also in other Greek philosophers such as Empedocles, but also in more recent Western philosophers, Spinoza, Leibniz, Herder, Goethe, Schopenhauer. And for those who say, yeah, okay, but they're rather unusual. And what about sort of what about the Enlightenment philosophers? Well, let me just quote from one now. All is in perpetual flux. Every animal has something of the human. Every mineral has something of the plant. Every plant has something of the animal. There is nothing circumscribed in nature. Each form has its own proper fortune or misfortune. From the elephant to the flea, from the flea to the sensitive and living molecule, the origin of everything. There is not a point anywhere in the whole of nature that does not suffer or take delight. That's from Diderot d'Alembert's Dream. So to recap, and then I'll move on to my second section. I think this was probably the longer one, the longest of the three. It seems that we can say mind and matter have a close relationship, that we cannot logically dismiss the existence of consciousness and ought to be unwilling to dismiss the existence of matter, that they're not so distinct that they cannot interact, that neither are they identical, and yet may be aspects of one and the same reality. Nonetheless, they're not equal, in that there is reason to believe that consciousness is prior ontologically to matter. So to move on to a consideration of consciousness and life and the role of brains, here, broadly speaking, I adopt a position taken by the philosopher and biologist Robert Rosen, which immediately struck an amazed note of recognition in me when I heard it, which is that life is not a peculiar element in a basically inanimate cosmos, but that inanimacy is a limit case of animacy, that effectively the whole cosmos is living, but that the bits that we call inanimate are those in which the characteristic elements of life are at a minimum. And I don't think there's a hard and fast boundary between, therefore, animacy and inanimacy. Inanimacy, if it could really be achieved or exist, would simply be the ultimately reduced case of animacy asymptotically approaching inanimacy. And what animacy does, it seems to me, is do two things. It enables processes to develop many, many, many orders of magnitude faster, billions of times faster than they would without it. And they also magnify the responsiveness, the interresponsiveness of elements in that cosmos. Those are the distinguishing features to me of what we call animate. And there are sacrifices made by living and evolving in terms of what we're always taught the whole game is about is, being able to achieve persistence. Because as Whitehead again pointed out, the key to persistence is not to be alive. Inanimate things decay much slower than living things. And there are huge costs to developing and becoming more highly evolved. More highly evolved creatures tend to have relatively short lives. There are, in fact, sea creatures at the depths of the ocean that not just their type, but the individual cases of such cells are possibly 500,000 years old. Now, that's something we can't say for most of us. James Shapiro, professor of molecular biology at the University of Chicago, says life requires cognition at all levels. What he's suggesting is that cells are themselves capable of cognition, and I have no doubt that the evidence suggests exactly this. They seem to act purposefully and solve problems that they couldn't be, quote, programmed to have a solution to. So where do brains fit into this? Are neurons, let alone brains, necessary for awareness? Well, let's start with brains. It seems that there's an argument that somehow neuronal complexity allows consciousness to emerge. I mean, again, the rabbit comes out of the hat, and here that word complexity suggests that, I'm clever, I'm doing something very complex here, trying to understand complex relations. And I think I've got where consciousness comes out of. I don't buy this. And certainly neuronal complexity is neither sufficient nor even necessary for awareness. The conscious part of our brains, the bit that we think of as mainly our brains, the neocortex, has 16 to 26 billion neurons in the human cerebral cortex. But there are a staggering 69 to 101 billion neurons, that's approximately 4 times as many, in the cerebellum. And it's not that, well, they must be very simple cells. In fact, probably some of the most highly interconnected, richly interconnected cells, Purkinje cells, only exist in the cerebellum. Yet the cerebellum is completely incapable of supporting self-awareness, what we normally call waking consciousness. In any case, complexity is not always advantageous. A recent paper entitled Optimal Degrees of Synaptic Connectivity claims that sparse connectivity is sometimes superior to dense connectivity, a finding that helps to explain the mind-boggling fact that the mean number of neurons reaches a maximum, I'm sure you know this, at 28 weeks of gestation out of the 40, and then declines by approximately 70%. Not declines to 70%, declines by 70% to achieve a stable number of neurons around birth. Is your brain really necessary? This is the title of a provocative paper referring to a case known to a neuropediatrician called John Lorber, of a student at Leeds University, Sheffield University, can't remember which, who had a first in maths, an IQ of 126, and was socially completely normal, but on a brain scan was found to have perhaps a tenth of the volume of cortex that would be expected, simply a rim of cortex. And it's not an unusual case. There are many others in the literature. Most striking to me are cases of something called hydranencephaly. You may well have heard of hydrocephaly, in which there is an excess of fluid inside the skull, which often causes the skull to deform. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking hydranencephaly. Anencephaly is when there is no brain. So there is no brain. The whole space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And such people, and a number of them have been studied, have minimal or practically non-existent cortex. Yet they all nevertheless possessed, the ones that have been studied, discriminative awareness. They had functional vision, could orient themselves, could distinguish familiar from unfamiliar people and environments, showed toy preferences, could interact socially, could respond to and discriminate pieces of music, and demonstrated not just awareness of their own body, but appropriate effective responses to others, as well as associative learning. So let's go where there are no neurons. How about slime molds? Clearly there are no neurons in slime molds. These are simple aggregates of course, the word simple is a bit of a joke when applied to any cell, but they are single cells that aggregate together to make clumps of cells. And slime molds, as those who have experimented with them in laboratories, are expert at escaping from their petri dishes, so they have to be, as it were, chained down. And they've been trained to solve mazes in the way that rats can be trained to solve a maze. They appear to be aware of the environment in such a way as to act intelligently on preferences, initiate sequences of behavior that are coordinated and flexible, learn from experience and memorize, and produce what appear to be a complex series of transformations in the whole organism, carried out at the level of individual cells, which at some stages act independently, but others in the service of higher orders of structure of which the individual cells appear to be aware. I mean, one of the things that's really very interesting about this is that if you cut a piece off a slime mold that has learnt to solve a maze, that part slime mold will also carry the memory of how to solve the maze. We know this about nematode worms, which are considerably more complex, that if you chop the head off one that has certain particular memories it's learned through experiment, it will grow a new head, and the new head will have the memories that the old head had. So can plants remember and make decisions? Effectively, yes, they can. And this literature, again, I could wax lyrical about, but I'll just mention one or two things. One of them is the sensitive plant Mimosa pudica, which, as you know, if you stroke it, it closes. If you carry on stroking it, it learns there's not really anything to fear, so it stops closing. You might just say, well, it's fatigued, which is a technical term in neurology. If you overstimulate a certain pathway, it becomes fatigued, which means that it can no longer respond. But that's not the case, because if you have been touching it with a finger, you then drop a drop of water on it, suddenly closes. So it sort of knows something different is going on here that is worth the energy cost of closing. And Monica Galliano, amongst a number of other plant biologists, says, when I talk about plants learning, I mean learning. When I talk about memory, I mean memory. I'll just try very briefly to explain an experiment that blows my mind. Anyway, pea plants were grown in an environment where they craved light. And experimentally, a light would turn on for periods of time in one or another arm of a Y-shaped maze, as they call it, above the plant. So the plant's at the bottom of the Y, and light comes on in one or the other branch. Obviously, it's in the plant's interest to maximize the amount of time that it's in the area where the light comes from. So if it has any clue as to where the light's going to come from, if it were an intelligent being, it would act on that. Well, guess this. In the experiment, a fan gave a blast of air down one arm, and later that was the one down which the light came. And in 3 days, the pea plants had learnt to gravitate towards the arm where the blast of air came. Now, that's not something that they could be programmed for in nature. In case you remain skeptical, a control experiment had the same setup, but opposite conditions, so that the arm down which the blast of air came was the one down which the light would not appear. And the plants similarly learnt it. So I'm just mentioning that rather briefly, but there's a whole host of things we see. I mean, the thing is that they clearly have intentions. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that plants intend certain things. They just move rather slowly compared with animals. When animals have an intention, they move around in the environment, and more advanced animals move muscles. But when trees and plants intend something, they grow and change their form. As Aristotle knew, motion in the sense of locomotion in the environment was only one form of 4 forms of motion, including the way in which plants grow. Darwin described how the roots of plants and the tendrils of plants engage in what he calls circumnutation, N-U-T-A-T-I-O-N, a slowly spiraling movement affecting all parts of the plant, including the roots. And he considers the possible explanations of this and says one alternative alone is left, namely that worms and plants, although standing low in the scale of organization, possess some degree of intelligence. Well, actually, he said that about worms, but his argument seems to be entirely applicable to plants too. Do plants have experientiality? I believe it's both a reasonable and an intuitively compelling assumption that they do. Plants appear to be driven to survive, to adapt, and to help other members of their species, just as we are, and even single cells have such drives. One idea about this is that somehow consciousness evolves late on in the process of evolution, that it is, as it were, a late comer. But the difficulty with that is that this trick would have to be performed at least 3 times in what we know of the history of evolution, according to Peter Godfrey Smith, who's written about octopuses and consciousness, something we know a lot more about even since the time when he wrote that book. He says, suppose it's right, and he gives evidence that crabs, octopuses, and cats all have subjective experience of some kind. I think that's undeniable myself. Then there were at least 3 separate origins for this trait, and perhaps many more than 3, because the branches of the tree of evolution had separated before. They're not connected, they're not stages down the same branch, if you see what I mean. They're on different branches, each of which, according to the idea that somehow it just emerges late on in evolution, according to that theory, at least it would have to have happened those 3 times. The idea that only humans have consciousness, I think it's becoming less credible. I mean, it's incredible to me, but I think it's becoming less credited, let me put it that way, in general culture, slowly. But it was something that appalled and astonished me when I was training and doing anesthetics, to learn that until the 1970s in Britain, and certainly in America, babies were often operated on without an anesthetic because, they didn't have consciousness, they couldn't feel. It's slightly like Descartes' idea that when you hurt animals, the sounds that they make are merely like the creakings of machinery. They don't correspond to inwardness. So it's an inglorious idea and a ridiculously human chauvinistic idea that we alone have this awareness, and one I think that we should both intellectually, imaginatively, and morally drop. So why are the brains at all? Well, they are the material counterpart, as I say, for a while, of some aspect of consciousness, and they give permanence to it, relative permanence. Remember Schopenhauer, matter is that which persists and endures. And they do manage this in a wonderful way. They give a sort of degree of persistence, but they don't, in any sense, have the capacity to predestine your thoughts, your movements, or anything of this kind. This Laplacian fantasy, physicists know very well that this is impossible. And it's often said by non-physicists, well, yes, I know, but I mean, this is all to do with quantum, isn't it? And, you know, quantum is all very well when you're dealing with a molecule, but we're dealing with the real world at the sort of human scale of the observable events in the real world. And you know, quantum simply washes out that. Absolutely untrue. Henry Stapp was very eloquent on this topic. But I was directed to a paper by a colleague who's a physicist about the way in which small quantum effects translate at the everyday level. And this concerns the Laplacian image of billiard balls, the famous old chestnut that, as it were, the molecule, if you knew the position and the momentum of every particle in the universe at a certain point in history, you could predict every single thing, including your current thoughts and beliefs from that by a calculation, in theory. But they talk about how quantum effects affect the collision of billiard balls. So that if you have a set of billiard balls that could infinitely interact over a period of time without losing their momentum, you would soon find that you couldn't predict, not just because you didn't have enough information, but you actually intrinsically could not predict the exact paths that were going to be taken. And I thought, well, that's really fascinating. I wonder how many collisions this would take. Billions or possibly even only a few million? The answer is 8. I mean, 8 collisions. So this to me is interesting. And the Libet experiments, there's a lot to say about them, but they don't stand up. They rely on, I'm not going to describe them because I don't want to waste time, but I mean, if somebody doesn't know what they are, they can look them up. Benjamin Libet in 1985 and onwards did experiments on getting people to respond to respond as they thought voluntarily. To initiate an action voluntarily, moving a finger. And an EEG trace showed what's called a readiness potential that was earlier than their awareness that they were making a decision, which led to the absurd cod philosophical idea that somehow your brain knows something before you do. These depended on estimates by experimental subjects of when they thought they decided to carry out an action, and they indicate only the timing of when they came to have a belief about when they became aware of a conscious immediate intention to act. And we know that the decision to act is in any case unconscious. And subjects were instructed at the outset that they would be making choices to move a finger. So they and their brains were at all times in a state of meta readiness to decide when to make that decision. We now know that the readiness potential is observable in humans and monkeys before they've been asked to start the experiment, if they know the terms on which they're being told to respond, or they understand what it is that's required of them. It's nothing to do with a particular event. And there are further problems, the precision of trying to record such a moment. The readiness potential occurs frequently without heralding action. It may signal the brain gathering evidence for or against an action. It happens before the subject is even presented with options. The readiness potential sometimes happens when the decision is not to move. And electrophysiological experts, neurophysiologists, if asked to study EEGs and point to the moment when an action was initiated, they cannot discriminate from the trace between action and inaction. So beginning to wind up here, you'll be pleased to learn. How about permission? I just want to seize on that to end with and relate it to the hemispheres. The important point here is that it involves both, inhibition and facilitation together. Some things are permitted to pass, some things are not. In other words, it is a sculpting process. And I believe that the image whereby things come into being is not that of a machine being put together in the garage, but if it has to be related to any human activity, the activity is that of Michelangelo producing David, starting from a formless block of stone and discarding. And it's simply by discarding that the sculpture, the statue, the work of art comes into being. William Blake, every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight enclosed in the five senses. It's often been read without noticing the word enclosed. After all, the senses are surely, aren't they, the portals whereby we take in that immense world of delight. But I think what he's suggesting is that by the very fact of filtering, they create the experiences of the world that we have, so that they're not illusions, they are imaginative responses to the world that allow certain aspects of it to present to us. Because if it could theoretically all present, it would be like the block of stone. There'd be nothing there, nothing individuated. Famously, again, Shelley said, life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. And I think that consciousness could be said to have this role in, like a stained glass dome, allowing certain things to come into being for us, the patterns, the colors that otherwise wouldn't exist, because the colored glass blocks certain frequencies of light. And interestingly, the cell membrane is a semiconductor. It has to be good at both resisting and conducting. Just want to chuck in an interesting idea, which seems to me, possibly to give further thought that permission may be more likely than emission from the brain. When one has a brain injury, it's not as though a bit of a machine has gone on the blink, because then the brain would simply carry on like a machine that had an effective part in it. But what happens is that the whole seems to know that something is no longer happening, and that the bit that would permit this thing to happen is no longer there, and develops it, so that bits of the brain that have no experience of, as it were, seeing in a certain way or hearing a certain frequency, or even perhaps hearing at all, are then commandeered by the brain to respond to whatever it is that is coming to the brain, and it knows that it used to, but isn't anymore. Bernardo Kastrup, who I know has spoken eloquently in this series, and probably has spoken about his work on mediums, writing in a trance. And when there is more complex writing going on, the brain seems to be less active. This seems like a phenomenon called terminal lucidity, where when people are approaching death, their brains are in essence failing. A lot more is permitted, as it were, as if the filter is breaking down, to come through. And so experiences that otherwise wouldn't happen do happen. This may be true of near-death experiences. In other words, things that would normally be filtered out to enable us to get on with the business of living daily lives are no longer filtered out. It could also be what happens when people take mind-altering substances, which, by the way, do not liberate the right brain. That's not the point. What they may do, though, is impede the effects, the filtering effects, the inhibitory effects, the very importantly creative inhibitory effects of the frontal lobes. so that material, as it were, comes into being that wouldn't normally do so, which is not to say that it's illusory. It's just that it's one of the functions of the frontal lobe to sculpt a world, which is the world that we know and love, and occasionally we can transcend that. Bergson, Henri Bergson, very, very underrated, important philosopher. No philosopher I know of really has written so extensively about memory and consciousness so intelligently. But he saw the point of memory as not to transmit, but to mask aspects of the past for efficacy. And Wilder Penfield's experiments on brains in the 50s and 60s, in which parts of the brain were stimulated at an operation, showed that memories that were unavailable to the waking brain in the normal state have been retained intact. And occasionally brain injury may result in exceptional access to memory. So less is often more. Gosh, I wish people understood that nowadays. That's almost the defining idiocy of our age, that more of whatever it is, however good it looks, is always better, because it's always a coincidence of opposites. The further you go, you start to uncreate the world and create the problem that you are trying to avoid. So Henry Stapp's explanation of the interaction of consciousness with nature stipulates a set, I think a good idea, a set of potential outcomes that is being narrowed to one actual outcome. And one way of putting this is that potentiality is collapsed into the actual through the brain's interaction with consciousness. And that is what we then experience. I like this image from William James, that he says, it's like my vocal cords. If I have no vocal cords, the air passes through and nothing is said. There is no meaning. But my vocal cords constrain, they resist the passage of the air. And in doing so, they cause sounds, they cause words, they cause music. And these are the things that have meaning. So it is interesting, isn't it? The brain becomes more powerful by shedding neurons and pruning the connections of those neurons. That a primary function of the corpus callosum, as I've argued at length, is in fact to inhibit, and it's probably the single most important function of the frontal lobes, to inhibit, and that the human brain has proportionately more inhibitory neurons than any primate, and that primates have many more inhibitory neurons than any other animals. And it's this that enables them to see things, to understand things that perhaps other animals can't. Which is not to say that other animals cannot understand and see things that we can't, clearly, much as they can hear frequencies of sound that we can't. So this idea of resistance as creative is very important. Schelling, a philosopher again that I admire greatly, noted that resistance in flow is creative of whatever comes into being, and that resistance emerges from the flow. It's not an extra added in. It is something about the nature of the flow that causes resistance to itself, and out of that come into being vortices. And those vortices are not in the water, they are the water. They're not extra to the water, they are the water for the time that they're there. And while they're there, they have force to move things, power. They can be photographed, they can be measured, they're perfectly real, but they are part of that flow. So finally, what is consciousness of? Hey. Hello, are we okay? Can I carry on or something?
Yes, you can. Somebody accidentally unmuted.
Oh, okay, that's fine. So if, as I believe, reality is exactly what it seems, not a projection on an internal screen, we're not separated from reality. As embodied imaginative creatures, as Lakoff and Johnson say, we never were separated or divorced from reality in the first place. What has always made science possible is our embodiment, not our transcendence of it, and our imagination, not our avoidance of it. Indeed, I argue in the book that imagination is necessary for every attempt to understand the world, including, and perhaps as much as anything else, in science. So what is consciousness for? I argue that this is to misunderstand wholly the nature of consciousness. Consciousness is not to our purposes. We are to the purposes of consciousness. Man said, Julian Huxley is that part of reality in which and through which the cosmic process has become conscious, has begun to comprehend itself. And Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, man discovers that he is nothing else than evolution become conscious of itself. Thomas Nagel, more recently, each of our lives is a part of the lengthy process of the universe gradually waking up and becoming aware of itself. And in a necessary and very easy tribute to make to another person I enormously admire, David Bohm, there is no need to regard the observer as basically separate from what he sees, nor to reduce him to an epiphenomenon of the objective process. More broadly, one could say that through the human being, the universe has created a mirror to observe itself. I would argue against the word mirror actually there, but the idea is present. And this makes sense of otherwise very hard problems. If the material cosmos is an emanation or projection of a grounding consciousness, it will, as a matter of course, have the necessary, apparently fine-tuned conditions to come into existence. It will naturally have the qualities of order, beauty, and complexity because it issues from a consciousness that, like us, is attuned to and gives rise to such elements. It will naturally produce conscious beings, and the conscious beings will naturally be able to speak its language, as David Deutsch says. We find that astonishing. How is it wherever we go, as it were, we speak the language of the cosmos, and the cosmos speaks our language, since they're generated by it. And of course, this doesn't answer the unanswerable question why there's something rather than nothing. It can do no more than postulate that the grounding consciousness is intrinsically creative, that part of its self-realization is the realization of the cosmos, something, not nothing. So, I mean, of course, this is to make assumptions, but all models make assumptions. I mean, that's the nature of the model. We cannot evade that. Science makes many assumptions quite correctly because it couldn't get anywhere without making them. My only quarrel is when it pretends it's not making assumptions. And to make the assumption that the universe is not conscious, that it is not complexly ordered, but actually random, chaotic, and meaningless, and that these other things simply emerge out of it eventually is, I think, to create more problems than it answers. And it's actually rationally helps explain things better to understand that the universe is actually conscious. It makes complete sense to me. And attempts to do without it result in the extravagant postulate that there are an infinite number of universes, so that eventually one like this is bound to come about by chance. That, of course, is neither scientific nor philosophically rational explanation of anything. It doesn't explain anything. It just says that I give up. So I'm going to create the news that everything exists ultimately anyway. So nothing exists, because if everything exists, then nothing can be said to exist, to stand out as something that is against a background of otherwise nothingness. How does our individual consciousness relate to this conscious universe? Well, Einstein said a human being is a part, limited in time and space, of the whole that we call the universe. He experiences himself and his feelings as cut off from the rest, an optical illusion of his consciousness. Other physicists have embraced similar notions. Bohm proposed human participation in a greater collective mind, in principle capable of going indefinitely beyond even the human species as a whole. James had images of trees that above the ground appear separate, but under the ground we know, and Merlin Sheldrake has recently written beautifully about this, form part of a single living web, or they're like islands that appear above the water but are connected at the ocean floor. My preferred way is to think of waves in the sea or vortices in a stream. They're not separate from the stream. The waves are not separate from the sea. They're there for a while. They have force. They're measurable. They're visible. But they just are the nature of that sea, that river, for a while in that place. And another image I use is that of the outpouchings of the membrane of a cell in like villi. If you were in one of those villi in the cytoplasm that's enclosed in one of these fronds of the cell, everywhere you looked, you would appear to be enclosed unless you saw the tiny bit which connects you to the whole cytoplasm of the cell. But nonetheless, inside that, you are completely connected to the whole cytoplasm, which works as a whole. So I believe that what exists is a locally differentiated, but ultimately single field of potentiality, which is constantly actualizing itself. Thus, all is one, but very importantly, the other truth is that all is many, and you must not collapse into one simple unity, these two non-dual elements. We need not just simple non-duality, which is just a sort of collapse. We need the non-duality of non-duality and duality, much as we need both either or and both and, not just either or both and, which tend to be tendencies in the way a lot of people think. So all is one and all is many. Each differentiation is, however, also a gestalt that is complete in itself, a new whole, not a fragment. It is, in German, ein Teil, a part of a whole, not ein Stück, which is like a fragment. I mean, we use the word part for both, but it's a very important difference there. A body part is not a part of a machine. It's something that has differentiated itself out of the whole organism and is completely connected to the whole of the rest of the organism. So this seems to me the essence of creation, differentiation of something that's not thereby destroyed in its unity, but enriched, as with the unfolding of something hitherto implicit into a new, more explicit order, which then re-enfolds it into an explicit whole. And I believe, from my understanding of David Bohm, that this is an image that he would, I dare to say, resonate with and support. And it's certainly one that the great scientist, theologian Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century explained in his own words, very similarly to David Bohm. So I see matter as a special case of consciousness, which is the primal stuff out of which the universe is made. The hemisphere hypothesis, how does this relate? Well, as Bohr says, the mental content is invariably altered when the attention is concentrated on any single feature of it. And Pauli thought that the nature of the consciousness as it attends changes what it is that it finds. So as is incontrovertible, the two hemispheres attend to the world in different ways. Not only will they bring into the world different experiences for that experiencing mind, but they will actually alter the nature of reality. And Bohr contended that this offered an essential clarification of the psychophysical parallelism. If reality is mental, as so many physicists repeatedly stress, and has a dual mode with mutually incompossible, but nonetheless complementary features, such as particle and wave, both of which are needed, that constitutes a remarkable parallel between the complementarity of the physicists and the complementarity of the two modes of attention that I believe underwrite our paradoxical mental life, in which we encounter the world. Encounter is in the title, because it's not that we make it, and it's not that we just see it, it's that we encounter it, which is always a two-way process, which again, the right hemisphere would understand, but the left hemisphere would not. And these remarks of physicists corroborate the idea that within the complementarity, one of the parties is ontologically prior to the other, mind to matter, wave to particle. Louis de Broglie said this, Planck said this, Heisenberg said this, James Jean said this, you name it. If they were great physicists, they said something to this effect, and I said I wouldn't go on quoting them. So I'd like to drop it there. I've been a little bit longer than I thought I would be, but we've still got, you know, certainly 40 minutes, and if you want a little bit longer, for questions. Thank you very much.
Wow. Wow. Thank you very much. That was overwhelming. I wouldn't dare to summarize what has just occurred here because I couldn't possibly do it. I would like to say that you said you were not going to evidence your point, and I think you undersold yourself, because I think you just gave such a beautiful, accessible talk that was so deeply rich and referenced. I cannot wait to watch the recording and take notes.
Well, thank you.
And in the chat, as the sun has been lighting you up throughout your hour, people have been describing the way in which you have been enlightening us. So thank you so much.
I just point out that the light no longer seems to be coming out of my brain, but out of my nose.
So we would love to hear from anyone in the group here who would like to add anything to the discussion. So we would request that you put your hand up either electronically or visually. We'll be looking for people who prefer to use their actual hands. And we'd like to hear from as many of you as we can possibly hear from. So just ask if you could try to be succinct as much as it is possible in this subject matter. We would really appreciate it, so we can include as many people as possible. And I see that we have Gary Goldberg's hand up. Gary?
Hi, Ian.
Hello, Gary.
Magnificent, beyond belief. I'm wondering, I have a question. I wonder whether the purpose of consciousness in some way is to support the reality of relationality and communication, and the concept that transaction is essential between self and other, between internal and external, that there must be connection, because that's how the universe stays in existence. And this is, something that Peirce talked about, Charles Sanders Peirce, is the idea of continuity, that there is continuity at the base of existence. And that's his idea of syncretism, which he posed against Cartesian nominalism, which basically says everything comes apart, right? Everything is separated from, which means that communication is not real. Communication is really not possible, right? Because we, as John Dewey says, we're encasketed. We're like, and Leibniz called us monads without windows, locked into our beings without the possibility of connecting to others.
Right.
And of course, that has huge moral implications.
Yeah.
Right. That we are responsible for each other, that we are morally obligated to each other as a result of just being in existence.
Well, of course, I would agree with virtually all of that, Gary. I also argue in the book that we have a moral obligation, which is not just the rather obvious one to one another socially, which is very important, of course, but that actually we have a moral obligation because we are, whether we like it or not, bound up in the creative process of the cosmos. We are not the playthings of this cosmos, but we are invited into some synergistic creative process in which our consciousness, which is not just an advantage for us, which makes our lives shorter, that makes us able to suffer, which makes us, as I was pointing out, Whitehead said the secret to persistence is simply not to live. But so what we do with that is we are able to help this process, which Whitehead describes, as you know, as God and what he calls the world sort of mutually coming into being through one another. And it can be argued, and theologians don't very much like me saying that God is coming into being. I think that it's quite coherent to say that God sort of exists eternally anyway, but is nonetheless always in process, and that this process is part of the whole business of the cosmos as much as we can understand. It seems central to it. And all I would really add is, I said that relation is prior to relata, and I very strongly argue that this, and physicists are saying this, David Mermin actually says exactly that in those words. But it's there in Vedantic myths, particularly that of Indra's net, one I often recur to, the idea of this net that covers the cosmos, in which the net is not the nodes, as it were, although the nodes, once the connections, as it were, come into being the relations, there is then a net. And at each point in that net, there is a jewel that reflects all the others. So there is a differentiation, but it is not a sundering. It is part of the whole.
I could say just one thing. John Dewey says that the relation is supra-subjective. Supra-subjective. The relata are the subjects. So I'll just stop there.
I love all of this so much. Shantina.
Do we have voice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, Diana. Hello, Iain.
Hello, Shantina. Hello.
Thank you super very much for a wonderful talk. I've devoured your master and his emissary, and I'm very much looking forward to your next book.
Thank you.
Well, I'll take advantage of this privilege of speaking now for asking you a question which was basically asked already by Schrödinger in 1935. No, 1943. And one of my obsessions is with quantum physics. And the question is, what in the frame of this very articulate vision that you've described, is there any connection between quantum indeterminacy and life?
And what?
Life.
Life. I'm sure there is. I feel convinced that there is, but I'm not a physicist. I've written about physics in the book, but I've always run what I've wanted to say past physicists to make sure that I'm not committing an obvious solecism. So I don't know the part that it plays. I mean, what I do know is that Schrödinger's writings about, I mean, his great essay, Science and Humanism, I think, and he gave some lectures in Cambridge in the early 1950s. And in fact, I take a kind of lead from him because he asked this question, what is man? He's asking a question from Plotinus, you know, who are we, he says. Who are we? And he said, in as much as any special branch of science does not add to the understanding of who we are, it has not been profitable. So I would say these things are very closely connected and should be seen as such. And what worries me is the way in which science has become so sundered, so siloed, so split up, that people see only the bit that they are working on and not how this contributes to a bigger picture and a wiser understanding of who we are, what the world is, and how the two connect. And you know, in brief, what I argue, well, I don't argue this particularly in the book, except I do say at the end, that it all will be vain if we can, by some wonderful miracle, we can reverse some of the damage we've done to nature. If we can reverse the poisoning of the seas and the destruction of the forests and the destruction of the ways of life of indigenous people. But it will all be in vain if we don't change in the way in which we think about these questions. Who are we? What is the world? And how do we relate? Because we'll simply go on being the same selfish, isolated, miserable people that we appear to be at the moment, behaving destructively. But there's a lot more that could be said, of course. But thank you very much, Shantina.
Yeah.
Your question.
Well, let me just add one more thing. It's like, in one perspective, you could see life and quantum indeterminacy as being the same on two different scales. You talked about scales.
Yes.
It's like, is life, quantum indeterminacy spelled large, or quantum indeterminacy is life spelled small?
I'm sure there's a great deal of wisdom in that, and I wouldn't ever want to say that quantum anything and life were the same, because I don't have the basic understanding of what you mean by that. But what I would say is that clearly the quantum phenomena, as I understand them, support the idea of effectively the notion of fields being primary, that forms are primary, and that the interaction of form and energy is what gives rise to everything. And life is, as I said, a special version of this, in which two things happen: that the speed of change, the possible range with which something can be achieved, is enormously enhanced, and in which the responsiveness is enhanced. So A rock may respond to something in its own way, and we can see physical reactions. But the sort of response that you and I can have to the St. Matthew Passion is something else. And I see that the reason that consciousness has evolved in this way is to produce valuing beings. It may surprise some people that in the third part of the book, in which I look at, as it were, the metaphysics of the cosmos, I have a couple on the structure to do with the coincidence of opposites and the relationship between the one and the many, which seems to me absolutely essential and foundational. And I then look at things like space and time and motion and matter and consciousness and all that. But I also have chapters on, because I think they're also foundational, non-reducible elements in the cosmos, value and purpose, as well as the sense of the sacred. They're not extractable from anything else. And even a philosopher, a great philosopher, a friend of mine, I can proudly say, Derek Parfit, who was an atheist, I mean, believed that values simply couldn't be accounted for on any other basis than that they were ontological primitives. And that is a position I take. I also think that purpose is like this as well. And it doesn't mean I believe in an engineering God. Absolutely not. That's a denial of what I mean by purpose. That's to say that there needs to be somebody tinkering with the universe in order to make it purposeful. Whereas what I see is a beautiful, endlessly creative, endlessly complex and re-complexifying entity that is moving towards this unfolding of individuality, which does nothing to destroy the wholeness of the whole. And to me, that's what I mean by purpose. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to allow other people to answer.
Beautiful, beautiful. I see one of our other speakers from this series, Gary Lockman, has his hand up.
Right. Gary, hello.
Yeah, just very briefly, fantastic talk, and I can't wait to read the book. But I have to say, I was struck by how similar to sort of the Western Hermetic tradition, much of how you were describing, how you were seeing the world and relationship and the consciousness, being part of the whole and things of that sort. And also you mentioned the German Romantics and the Natur philosophy. People like Fechner, I know he was one at the time saying that the universe is animate, yes, and the inanimate bits were they were the anomaly. The only point I wanted to make is usually when we sort of tend towards, it's a living universe, we go east. And we have a local kind of tradition of all this, but it's somehow, it seems sort of, marginalized or sort of disrespectful to turn to it. And even more contemporary kind of expressions of it, like Rudolf Steiner. Because, fundamentally, much of what you were saying, the relationship between consciousness and the world and the Goethean science and all that, he's basically talking about the same thing. And I know you're aware of this, but it just struck me in general that we tend not to sort of stay local when we want to make some connection with something like that. But thank you once again for a fantastic talk.
Well, thank you, Gary. And just a brief response to that. If you come to read my book, you will find that there is an enormous amount of reference to Oriental philosophy, both of China and of India and so on. But I wanted to help people see that even within our own tradition, and that therefore there isn't a binary here between East and West, there were all along voices that were saying, despite the fact that we've been trained to think in this way, I can't help seeing that it's like this. And you, of course, know very well David Scribina's book, Panpsychism in the West, which I must say I found absolutely fascinating, because I didn't know the depth and extent of that, even though I'd read your writings on similar subjects. And I also wanted to bring in, as well as Eastern, what's often called mysticism, I wanted to bring in certain aspects of the Western tradition that are not usually summed up as mystical, but have this sense, and of course they're there in certain aspects of Christianity. I mean, Christianity is a very, like Judaism, is a very multiple entity that has many, many aspects to it. And in Christianity, as well as an obsession with dogma and propositional belief, there is a vastly rich tradition, as you're only too aware of, a mystical sense of very profound things. I mentioned Nicholas of Cusa, but of course Meister Eckhart and many others. So, but thank you very much. What I've tried to do all along is to I want to bring things together. My whole aim is to bring things together. It's always to unite. It's not to drive a wedge. In our modern world, we're constantly driving wedges between groups of people, between ideas, we think in black and white, we put things in boxes, we tick them, and I really want to say, but look, see the thing as a whole, and you can see that everywhere in the world, people have had these intuitions. And as I say, not because they were simple people, but because they had richly, deeply thought about these things. And it goes on here in our culture as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for bringing that in. Naresh, I see that you had your hand up.
Yep, thanks a lot. Iain, thank you very much. I enjoyed your Master and the Emissary very much and look forward to reading the new book. I just wanted to see whether you can expand on the answer you provided in part to Shantana's question. In the Master and the Emissary, you talked quite a bit about, the left hemisphere dominance of Western civilization. And we know where that's leading us, with all the ecological damage and everything else that we have. And I am working now and struggling to see how this kind of understanding that you so lucidly put before us can be used in political science and public policy making. And wanted to see whether you can share with us where, if there is any encouragement, any possibilities in which this kind of understanding might get into this world of public policy and, if you like, hard-nosed partisan politics, which our world is so struck with, and we could become as enlightened as we wish at the individual level, but if collectively we are not making the shifts, then I'm afraid we will remain in darkness collectively. Can you shed a little bit more light in that direction?
Well, thanks for the question. It's a good one, a perfectly legitimate one. I think I'd begin by coming back to what I said about it doesn't matter what we do. I mean, in terms of saving the planet, there can be all kinds of policies about not destroying forests, about changing the way in which we allow toxic things to get into the sea and all the rest, all of which is very, very important. But it won't actually help because this is a spiritual problem manifesting itself as a physical threat. And typically of the left hemisphere, we're like, oh gosh, suddenly we're waking up. Oh dear, we can't go on being like this. We're going to have to change our lives. Well, we are going to, and I'm completely consonant with that. But the trouble is, people want me to give 8 bullet points, well, we need to do this in schools, and we do need to do things in schools differently from the way we do them. We need to do this in terms of governmental policy, and we definitely do. And we need to abandon many of the very stupid things we're obsessed with at the moment as solutions, which are not solutions. All of that I agree. But the danger is that what I do is feed into the very problem that I'm trying to help resolve. Because what I'm doing is, if I do that, is to say, as long as you do these 6 or 8 bullet points, we'll be okay. And I don't think we will. I don't think there's any bullet points that will ever help the ultimate problem. They're very important along the way. Typically, the left hemisphere is a good servant, but it is not a good master. So trying to explain what I'm doing in terms of a strategy is to feed entirely into the left hemisphere's position and to distract from the fact that this is a philosophical problem, a spiritual problem, a malaise that has seized us. And until we see that, we won't do the right things. That sounds a bit airy-fairy, but I'm a psychiatrist, or have practiced as a psychiatrist for a very long time. And when you're young and you don't know a lot, you're impressed by how much you can see of problems that are going on for people. And when you're naive, you start explaining to them, look, you're doing this. How about trying doing that? Because this hasn't worked for you, has it? You rarely get anywhere because if they were ready to hear that, they wouldn't have needed to come and see you. So what you have to do is help them, lead them to a place where they can see what they need to do, and then they will do it. They won't do it if you tell them to do it. And so what I am trying to do with whatever remaining time I've got is more like it's more like introducing people to a world, a landscape, a country that I have seen and that I believe they already know about, but they've been taught to disattend to it. They've been taught to devalue it, even dismiss it. And so it's more a matter of taking somebody by the hand and saying, look at this and look at this. Let's go on over here and have a look at the view there. And then if you see all of that, then you will know what to do. You will know how to go into this country and live. But if I just tell you, we can do this, we can do that and the other, you'll stay exactly where you are, hoping that as long as we get these things sorted, we've answered the problem, but we haven't. So that will feel very unsatisfactory to many people. And there is a temptation to say all kinds of things I could say, like, you know, the curriculum at school is wrong, the whole attitude to education is wrong. The way in which we think about, you know, how we relate to one another in social groups is disastrously wrong. It's just causing more strife, anger, aggression, where we need to be making peace, we need to be making love, not war. I can do all that and I can outline a few policies, but in a way it's to bring the whole thing down to a level where people go, oh, I feel comfortable with that.
Not phenomenal, you know. If nothing else, it gives me confidence to proceed with this new course I'm designing called Applied Spirituality and Public Policy.
Right, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
I don't know enough about that and I will find out more. Thank you very much.
Sounds wonderful. Thanks for bringing that in. John Olds, you had your hand up for a while now.
Yes, great talk, Ian. This reminds me of a Sufi saying, which goes like this. God sleeps in the rock, dreams in the plant, steers in the animal, and awakens in man. So it's an old Sufi saying, and you can replace God with consciousness and enlightenment. But the point I'm really interested about is the mind-body interface. So I just previewed with that saying. So basically, for example, imagine Archimedes. He discovered that there's a difference between true gold and false gold. And then when he submerged himself into his bath and the water rose up, then he had that enlightened point, Eureka, he shouted. But that Eureka was initiated by this thought, this breakthrough of thought, in which I can say to the queen or king or pharaoh, I'm not sure if it's, or to the king, that I can distinguish gold from false gold. But the thing is, with that thought, it's a conscious thought. Eureka, he exclaimed, and he ran out of to the streets naked. His heartbeat is elevated, so chemical changes are pushed into his body. The chemical changes that speeded up heartbeat, probably epinephrine or adrenaline, but all initiated by that thought of Eureka. So basically, thought influences physical chemistry, and that cannot really be explained by material science. So when we tackle that angle, we can really push the argument to the stubborn scientists, to material scientists, that in this scenario, your worldview, your paradigm sort of fails. So because it's a synchronous and spontaneous confluence of events. Eureka, and then suddenly your body is flushed with chemicals. But that event is intelligent, because when you get depressed, when you think that life is meaningless, then it secretes different chemical it depletes your dopamine and you behave in a different way. So we are living in an intelligent universe wherein our thought reacts with proper chemicals that conditions her body to get elated or to get depressed. So I just want to know your thoughts on that, Iain.
I think you're illuminating very well that, you know, mind and body interact powerfully in many ways. I wholly agree that. And it reinforces my belief that there is nothing simple about matter, that matter is itself a very complex thing. It's extraordinary to me as a psychiatrist that, you know, I can give somebody therapy and just their thoughts will change their brain chemistry. We can measure that. But I can equally give them medication that will change their brain chemistry and it will change their experience of the world. And of course, in a way, we know that because mind-altering substances have been known to human beings for a very long time. So yes, I mean, I wholly agree that these things are very close to one another. What I've done this evening is really to do an extraordinarily brief sketch, just trying to touch on a few things that I hope will set off resonances. I think if I were to attempt to say more about that, I'd really have to direct you to this long chapter, which one day I may publish as a book on its own, but at the moment anyway, it's quite a substantial part of this book, in which I argue about how these things do relate, not just in the matter and consciousness chapter either. In a way, it's an important theme in the book as a whole. But thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Iain.
Thank you for bringing that in. We have less than 15 minutes left. I see the three of you with your hands up, so we're going to get to you with certainty if we all keep moving along. And I have a chat that someone chatted me directly to ask a question. So I'm just going to, on behalf of Marie-France LePage from Montreal, Canada, I'm going to ask, I have somewhat intuited that a volcanic and a sedimentary rock might hold different memories of the experience of their creation. My question is, if consciousness permeates the cosmos, could we imagine that the Big Bang was already living and conscious in forms that we might never be able to conceive and not just a physical phenomena? Thank you for your response.
A good question, a very hard one to answer, except to say that I certainly wouldn't rule that out. And that may sound like, equivocation, but the only way in which we approach truth is by ruling out things that are just much less likely to be the case. Even science does this. It doesn't prove that things are the case. It proves that certain things, to its understanding, don't work. And in the book, I argue very much for the idea of truth, and this is my practice, truth as unconcealing, not as truth as correctness. So I can't state that, any particular awareness that you described is there in the volcano, but my hunch is this is a perfectly reasonable idea. If the universe is, the cosmos is conscious, as I believe it is, if cosmos is foundational to the existence of the material universe, then all I can say is that we don't know and will never know in this life. Our brains are just not equipped to know everything. How could they be? What an irrational idea that our brains, which are always in the process of evolving, why do we think we've got that? Why do people arrogantly believe that, oh, now we understand everything? I mean, there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect in psychology, which is the less you know, the more you think you got it. And, the more you know, the more you realize there's so much you don't know. So what I would say is embraced in that area that I don't know and you don't know and none of us will ever know is that possibility, which sounds to me like a very good possibility.
Beautiful, thank you. I know this is unreasonable with the three of you who have your hand up, but we have Richard, then Niels, and then John. And if you're able to make room for one another in 10 minutes, it would be quite impressive and I'd appreciate it. Richard.
Thank you very much. The previous questioner brought in a Sufi, and I'd like to bring in a Sufi, Ibn Arabi, and paraphrase him. 800 years ago in his great book, The Fusus, he said there are two sorts of people, I paraphrase him. There are materialists who really believe that matter is real, and they spend their time trying to work out then what is consciousness based on the fact that everything is material. And the other sort of people are people who see, well, consciousness is real, and then to spend their time trying to work out, well, if consciousness is real, how can we see things like matter? And I believe, of course, as you do, Ian, that the latter sort are the ones who have it right. And I think people like Ibn Arabi have a great wealth of wisdom from which we can learn. In fact, I think he's answered many of the questions that we are struggling to answer ourselves. But the question that was an observation. My question really is, it seems to me that what you are doing and people like Bernardo Kastrup are doing, you're engaged in trying to persuade people there is another way of seeing things. It seems to me that I believe we're at the start of a revolution. It's as if we were back in the 16th or the 17th century. The scientific revolution is starting. It's very hard for Bacon to see where it's going to go, but he knows he's onto something. Now, we're at that position in the next revolution. It's very hard for us to see where to go. We're still at the stage of trying to persuade people there's something here. And I wondered, what do you think, if we could go ahead, supposing we survive all the difficult problems we have, if we were to go ahead 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 years and look back, what sort of society are we now in 500 years' time? In what ways is it very different from the one that we now are in, just as the one we're now in is very different from the pre-scientific one?
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have total crystal ball failure. I think that it's foolish to predict the future, because one of the wonderful things, even about humanity with all its failings, is that we have resources that we don't know we have, and at times of crisis they can come out. What I think is that if we survive, we will have a quite different attitude to a living human community and to the world, but I don't know that. And so I'm not going to argue much longer because it's wasting other people's question time. But I just wanted to say, I'm a great admirer of Ibn Arabi too, but you set up a bit of a duality there between matter and consciousness, and I've really been at pains to try and suggest that that duality is not right, that consciousness is primary to matter, but that both of them exist, neither of them is an illusion. So I just leave you with that thought.
Beautiful, interesting. Sorry, we're in this speed round now, everyone. Niels.
Okay, thank you very much. I've admired you for quite a long time. I enjoyed your book, and I think I want to try and approach it slightly differently. You talk about the split brain, and the weak part of that is the left hemisphere, and the real wide and understanding part is the right hemisphere. So I have had the opportunity to discover something 30 years ago, which I believe is the way the right hemisphere operates. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I believe that it relates to mind itself. And I believe that that mind in the right hemisphere is what is a part of the universal mind, which is the universe, and the universal inspiration, which is the Holy Spirit. I happen to have been a Christian since I was 5. My father took his own life when I was 5, and I was really devastated. And I've asked the question, where's my dad? And I got the voice. We talk about the little voice, and that comes from the right hemisphere. And he said, do not worry. He just gave me peace of mind. And it wasn't until 6 years later I found out from someone in the street who said to me, "Did you know that your father took his own life?" My mother was so devastated, she didn't know what to do, so they kept it quiet. But what I'm saying is that wholeness is what, and implicate order, like Bohm talks about, is in the right brain.
You may
Which is.
Thank you very much for sharing a very moving story, and I think you may well be right. All I would say is that the left hemisphere's access to consciousness is limited. It's not that it doesn't partake of whatever. It's just that it's been specialized into just helping us get by focusing on the detail, whereas the right hemisphere is the one that sees the big picture. But thank you very much.
Can I just say?
I think we're coming to the very end. Somebody else.
Yeah, we only have 3 minutes. Sorry. That was so moving. Thank you for bringing that in. I would like to give John some space because I think he had his hand up last week as well and didn't have a chance.
Okay. But thank you, Neil, anyway. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I'll be quick. I've got 2 quick ones. I just wanted to know what your theory or what your view is on the holonomic theory of mind, which Giuseppe Vitiello presented to us earlier on in the series, and that Karl Pribram worked on with David Bohm. And secondly, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on what trauma is, and particularly what emotional trauma is in relation to perception and consciousness. And I realize that's a huge one, but I just, even if you could like Cole's noted, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes. 2 very difficult questions. I mean, the first one quite difficult because I don't feel confident talking about the holonomic universe. Not because I don't think it's right, but just because I don't know enough about it. But I do very strongly believe in a certain sense in which things that at one scale are parts, at another scale are wholes, and that parts and wholes are not sort of 2 types of things. Again, it's a problem with things, but that these are roles played by parts of the seamless whole at times, that one is a part for something else, but it's a whole for something else. And so everything that we conceive in a way has this dual role, and it depends on our attention what it becomes, once again. So I'm probably completely beside your point there, but I haven't got time, unfortunately. Neither of us has time to explore that any further. I mean, on trauma, golly, I don't know. I mean, all I would say is that emotion is not, as it were, a kind of coloring added onto life. You know, there's part of me that admires Damasio, but I'm afraid he never forgave me for it, never. But I reviewed Descartes' error somewhat adversely, saying that emotion is primary. And I think he sort of, in a way, says that at times, but he acts as though, and he even says it's just a coloring added on, as it were, a marker that helps you know how to behave. In other words, it guides cognition. Well, look, cognition is a Johnny-come-lately to the party. I mean, emotion is what it's about, in a way, depending on what you mean by emotion. I'm not lauding being subject to emotional problems, but we are grounded in feeling. And, you know, cogito ergo sum, I often say, I'm probably not the only person to say it, really more important is sentio ergo sum. I feel, therefore I am. And that thinking is something that is built on top of feeling. And I know that Damasio would agree about that. It was said by Vauvenargues in the 18th century that reason has taught us, emotion has taught us how to reason. So these things are not in conflict at all. But I can't tell you what I think trauma is. No, that would really be a seminar for a day or 2. But thank you very much for your question. All of you, actually, yes.
Yes, so beautiful. Thank you, Iain. This has been phenomenal. And all of you, I'm sorry that we didn't get to hear the full depth of what people wanted to ask and probably how you would have liked to have responded. We have a Sutra channel where we can keep the conversations going. particularly anyone who feels cut off, I hope you'll join us in the sutra and we can keep the discussion going. This was so stimulating, not only from Iain, but from all of you. So I really appreciate all of your contributions. Just before we go, I'd like to say that we hope that we can also see you for the next session, which will be on September 11th. And it's called Exploring the Earth Mind. It'll be a panel discussion with some wonderful people facilitated by John Briggs, who you may know co-authored about 3 books with David P. So we're really looking forward to that session. Eleanor's just posted the link in the chat. So, wow.
Can I say one more thing?
I hope you will.
Could you post a link to Channel McGilchrist? Because anybody who's interested in my work, if you don't already know, there has been for a year now a channel on which you can hear things you won't hear elsewhere. And you can hear me read parts of my new book as well. So you'll get a steal a march.
That is beautiful. That's so great. Wow. I am sad that we have to say goodbye to each other, that we've hit the top of the hour. This has been so exciting and enriching. And I guess till next week. Have a good week, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
so much to Dr. McGilchrist.